My name is Jessica Thompson, and for my EDU 5120 project, I implemented the flipped learning method in my class. The reason that I chose the flipped learning method was that the course was currently very teacher-centric. Two instructors teach this Marketing 1 course, and the first instructor has a lot more experience, and so she kind of set the tone. There was marginal engagement with the students. They were participating, but there wasn't really that spark that I, as an instructor, want to see in my students. So I was trying to find ways to engage them and really let them apply what they're learning in class. And I thought the flipped learning method would be a good option. Additionally, it is a district focus this year. We had training at the beginning of the year, and we have had cohorts that have been focusing on implementing the flipped learning method into our classrooms. So my question was, will the flipped learning method impact student engagement and retention? The breakdown of my student data, I have two sections of marketing because the previous instructor is on maternity leave right now. First hour is made up of 12 students, 6 males, 6 females, a range of sophomores, juniors, and seniors, and then it's also a very diverse class. Fifth hour is 11 students, 4 males, 7 females. Again, a mix of grades and a mix of ethnicities. The classes are very small. It is a second level class, so the students have already had to take and pass business communications and management. So the interventions that I decided to apply, I selected first hour as my flipped classroom. They would receive flipped video instruction, and they would take a pre and post assessment, end of lesson quizzes, and then they would take a student engagement survey. For fifth hour, I continued to instruct them as we had previously. It was lecture based. I would deliver the content, we would discuss it as we were going through, and then students would typically complete some sort of in-class activity or project. And again, they would be exposed to the pre and post assessment, the lesson quizzes, and the student engagement survey. The pre-assessment data showed that students were ready for instruction. There were some questions that students scored really high on. This chart shows you of the 10 questions, how many students in each section got that question right. The overall average scores for first hour were 6.3 questions were answered correctly, and for fifth hour, 5.6 questions were answered correctly. This was administered via paper copy, and I graded that for the students. The end of lesson quizzes, we had 5 lessons in this chapter, this unit, and they were administered and graded via Canvas. Canvas is our online learning management system that we use at my high school. And what I did in my paper, I have it broken down more into the high score, the low score, the class average, and then the average time that students spent on the quiz. I went ahead and just isolated the class average. So you can see that fifth hour, the course that received the traditional lecture-based instruction, outscored the first hour on their class average, for the exception of one test, and that was at lesson 9.4. There were a few things that could have played a role in this. Typically, fifth hour has a smaller number of students who are in there, just by nature of the class size. And then also in first hour, I have a student who is scheduled to receive read aloud services, but he does decline those. So his score typically did represent the lowest score for the first hour class. When I looked at the post-assessment data, the same 10 questions were exposed to the students, but they were nested inside of their larger unit quiz, their unit test. I went through, they filled out the question form for zip grade. I graded those, and then I kind of pulled that data out and put it into a chart similar to the one for the pre-assessment. Again, you can see I had 11 students take the test in first hour and 7 students take the test in fifth hour. This has been a very crazy 2-week time period for our students. There have been school days that we have had off for holidays. There have been days where I was gone for professional development. There have been sick days. There have been state wrestling tournaments, school-wide blood drives. So it's been a very difficult 2 weeks to have everybody in class at the same time. That's one of the struggles that I had. In fifth hour, like I said, I only had 7 students there that day. you can see the student scores did improve. First hour scores improved by 12%, and fifth hours improved by 11%. So I was very pleased that there was an increase from their pre-assessment data to their post-assessment data. And then the last component of what I gave to my students for my data collection was a student engagement survey. Now, I administered this via SurveyMonkey because I really wanted the students to feel like they could give their opinions. So this was completely anonymous. If I administered this via Canvas, I would have been able to see which student responded with what. It was a 10 question. These 4 questions were directly related to whether or not students were engaged in the flipped learning process. Question 6 asked the students, I liked the way that Ms. Thompson taught during this unit. They could select all of the time, most of the time, some of the time, and rarely. First hour had decently high scores in terms of all of the time and most of the time. But fifth hour, all of the students, 100% of those who took it, said that they enjoyed the way that the content was delivered all of the time or most of the time. Question 7 looked at, I was able to understand the material that I taught. Again, fifth hour had all of the students within all of the time or most of the time. There are few some of the times for first hour. Question 8 looked at how often do you feel the information that I taught helped you complete class activities. I was very glad to see that both sections said either all of the time or most of the time. And then, did you enjoy coming to class? For me, this was one of the big ones about student engagement. Did you want to get up out of bed and come to school that day? And first hour said all of the time and most of the time, as did fifth hour. So these basic results, they kind of reaffirmed that my students enjoyed my class and they enjoyed being there. But what was really good for me to look at when I was analyzing whether this impacted their student engagement was question 10, which was their open answer response. Now, I selected first hour's responses. There were 3 of them. The first one, I haven't gotten used to the idea of online classes yet, so I'm not a huge fan of them. I did like the convenience of them in case I was ever sick. A student also said, I like the way you taught this unit, but I prefer you talking to us in person. Either way, it was good. I learned as much as I could. And then I enjoyed the way the lesson was on YouTube, and I could stop it when I needed further information. I wouldn't change anything about this unit because I enjoyed it. These were a little bit more telltale and kind of helped me determine whether or not flipped learning had an impact on my student engagement. Overall, the students did enjoy the ability to stop and write and then restart the video, but I had many students, it was just very candidly as I was listening to them in class, they would have rather listened to me deliver that material because then they could stop me and ask me a question. So I thought that it was very good, as some students said, for being able to kind of learn at your own pace and for students who had absences, but I felt a somewhat of a disconnect with my students because I wasn't talking to them every day about that material. I would talk to them for a little bit one-on-one, and then they would really be working on their project. So overall, my results of this 2-week flipped learning method, the positive things, the advantages that I saw, that there was a higher completion rate. My students in first hour completed their quizzes more on time, and the in-class assignments were completed on time. This kind of echoes with a study that Moore, Gillett, and Steele did, where the class with the flipped learning had a higher completion rate of homework assignments. And then I also like the fact that my students had control of their learning. It was very cool to know that my students were stopping things and writing and then re-watching them so they could get the full gist of what I was trying to tell them without having to focus on writing something down as fast as they could. And that was echoed in a study from Smith in the Business Education Forum. Some of the disadvantages were student preference. I'm a very social person, and so to have a reduced whole class experience with my students kind of, that kind of bothered me a little bit, and the students seemed to prefer to listening to me in class. I've tried the flipped learning method in some of my other courses that I have at the high school, and I've given them the option, do you want to watch this video or do you want to hear me speak to you in class? And even if the video is shorter, the students have been selecting to hear me speak one-on-one to them in class. And then I would say that the test scores were kind of inconclusive. They both had gains, which is what I was looking for, but it wasn't significant enough and it wasn't consistent enough, in my opinion, for the flipped learning method to really say that it impacts student retention. Some of the things that, would be a problem with this are, again, attendance, making sure that the students are watching the whole video and not fast forwarding, which I know some of them did. They told me that. So overall, if I were to completely base my opinion on the flipped learning method from these two things, I would say that it definitely has benefits for the classroom, but it's probably not the best instructional method for all classes or all units. In the future, if I were going to implement this, I would use this on a circumstance where the basic content needs to be delivered prior to a lesson or a project. The students really enjoyed that interaction that we could have where they would say, okay, was this an example of what you're talking about? And they don't get that in the video. So if I'm delivering something very basic like parts of a marketing plan, or if I'm delivering key terms and explaining what each of those are, that would be a very appropriate method for the flipped learning. And there's lots of obstacles that you have to consider overcoming. During this unit, we had some issues in the district and surrounding districts, and the second day of the unit, my district completely blocked YouTube. So this was a huge obstacle for me to overcome in a flipped learning method classroom at that point. So it's something that needs to be implemented with the consent of the students, and it needs to be a really organic learning process for the students and the teachers, and you have to have that buy-in. There's also equipment that would make this much easier as well. So overall, I would say the flipped learning method did impact slightly some student engagement and some student retention, but I don't know if it had such a strong impact that I would consider completely flipping my classroom. And I would also really consider this type of students that I had in there and what that content was. I could see the flipped learning method being great for mathematics, being great for those very technical things where it's the drill and the process of doing them. But in something that's very creative like marketing, I find it difficult for me to really convey all of that in a short enough video that I will retain my students' attention. So overall, flipped learning method, it has its benefits, but it's something that you really need to think about and implement properly.